the talk today, and we'll just get started. Make sure I can advance. Here we go. Okay, so just some background information. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on to put on these monthly webinars, and many of the parties are listed here, and there's many who contribute that are not listed here. The next webinar will be on March 16th and will be led by Martha Shulsky with the Nebraska State Climate Office. You can get information on these webinars at the link below, and past recorded presentations and slides can be found in 2 different locations. And as Doug mentioned, type in your questions in the chat box or raise your hand at the end, and Doug will do the moderating of the questions at the end. So we'll get started from there. So the agenda that I have put together for today, going over the current conditions for the region, touching a lot of different variables there, some regional climate updates. I've heard a lot of good feedback from many of the states in the region this week and last week, and put some of those highlights together, and then we'll get into the outlooks of, you know, what can we be expecting going forward from here. So into the current conditions. Temperatures have been varied in the region over the last 30 days, so this is from the middle of January to present, and what we can see is in the northern, excuse me, this is precipitation. I have the wrong slide in here, so no wonder it looks odd. So looking at precipitation right away, I have it labeled temperature. I'm apologizing for that. I just caught it. We do see that precipitation through eastern Kansas, Missouri, into southern Illinois, along the border with Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio. There has been this dry pocket over the last 30 days. And being the time of year it is, the departures are not too great, but a lot of those areas where you're seeing a 3-inch departure from normal, those are quite significant even for this time of year. Along the borders of Nebraska and South Dakota and Iowa and Minnesota and into Wisconsin and Michigan, you can see where the band of snow that accumulated during a couple different snow events was placed and really started into Wyoming and with an eastward track. And also up along the Canadian border, there was some above normal precipitation for the last 30 days.
Say, Brian, if you want to look at the temperature map for the last 30 days, I pulled it up. You want me to show it?
Yeah, go ahead and show that, please, Doug.
It's fairly spectacular, so hold on. Can you see it?
Yeah, there it is. So just quickly, we can go and see quite evidently that almost the entire region was well above normal for the last 30 days. And really, when you go into the more northern reaches, Minnesota really stands out, up to 10 degrees above normal over the last 30 days. And only when we get into portions of Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota are we seeing anything that's even close to normal to slightly below normal. So quite evidently, what we can say is over the last month, we definitely have been seeing temperatures that are well above normal, and as we'll get to later in the presentation, we will expect that continuing. All right, back to where I'm at. So again, we already saw the normal departure from normal down below on the lower left, but in the upper right, the 30-day precipitation again really shows where that band of precipitation went through 300% of normal, with upwards of 3 to 4 inches above normal for the last 30 days in those areas. But you can also see the areas that have been dry, and the 2 red bands really stand out, both in the Dakotas as well as through Kansas, southern Nebraska, into Missouri and southern Illinois, where really less than 50%, even less than 25% of normal precipitation over the last month. And looking at the January climate summaries from NCEI, we can also see that in the upper right, the temperatures, again, have really been something we've talked about through much of the winter. in that most of the region, especially the east, central and eastern portions of the region, have had top 10 warmest Januaries on record out of 123 years. And as you go further to the west, they become near average, and even Wyoming a little bit below average for January. And precipitation, when you see a lot of the greens on the map, it's really showing near average to above average through almost all the region except in Montana. And looking at Wisconsin, you know, top 10 wettest January on record, as well as in Kansas and Colorado. And so the region as a whole has been fairly wet in the month of January, wet and fairly warm as well. So as we go back a little bit further and look at the 90-day values, the percent of normal precipitation, a couple features really start standing out to me, and that it's really almost the epicenter over Missouri and leaking into Kansas and Illinois both. That there has been this continual dryness that's been quite evident. Last 90 days, we're looking at about 25 to 50% of normal in Missouri, and extending out to about 50 to 75% of normal. And even though it is the winter months and it is a drier time of year climatologically, it still is being something that we're monitoring quite closely, and some people in those states have really started focusing on some of that dryness and some of the accompanying impacts associated with it. And when we start looking at the departures in the lower left, we are seeing that over the last 90 days, 4 to 6 inches below normal along the Illinois and Missouri borders, and even extending out from 2 to 4 inches below normal. But that pocket of dryness is quite evident in comparison to the rest of the region, where we are seeing anywhere from 2 to 4 inches above normal precipitation since the middle of November. And looking at that November to January climate, again, in the upper right with the temperatures, most all states east of the Missouri River Basin are showing top 10 warmest events. We also are seeing above average temperatures through the Dakotas into Nebraska, and then near average as we get into Wyoming and Montana. So you can see this transition from the northern Rockies into the central and eastern Corn Belt, as the temperatures really have been well above normal for an extended period of time for pretty much our entire winter. And then down in the precipitation graphics from November through January, we are seeing that moisture in the Dakotas, as well as Wyoming and Colorado, the dryness in Illinois and Missouri, and most other places are near average to slightly above average as far as their seasonal rankings of November through January based on the last 122 years. So looking at the water year, and for those not familiar with it, the water year is defined from the period of October 1st through September 30th each year. So these two maps are showing the percent of normal precipitation and the departure of normal precipitation starting going back to October 1st. And some of the comments from the Midwest were interesting, that the late summer rains really helped to recharge the soils in those regions, but since then it's been fairly dry, and that's fairly evident what we're seeing, you know, 25 to 50% of normal precipitation in parts of eastern Colorado, western Kansas, and then again that pocket that's centered in Missouri. And then as you look through the rest of the region, it's been pretty sporadic. Again, up in the Black Hills, there's been some dryness, as well as northeast Wyoming. But for the most part, a lot of Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the eastern portions of the Dakotas have been well above normal since going back to October 1st. And when we look at those departures, that's what's really starting to catch my eye in southern Missouri, southern Illinois, where we have areas that are 9 to 12 inches below normal, which is considered our recharge period for soil moisture. I think without the moisture that was received in the end of summer, we would be seeing some more significant issues developing in that region. And the comments coming from those areas is that if we continue to see this dryness as spring continues, then drought conditions will probably ramp up quite rapidly in association with just these deficits that we have seen since October. And I got the temperature graphic right here. So going back to October 1st and looking at the temperatures through yesterday, again, outside of the western Dakotas and Montana and northern Wyoming, almost the entire region is anywhere from 4 to 6 degrees above normal for temperatures. And that's just been a continuation of what we have seen for quite some time through this region. And again, the cooling temperatures in the northern Rockies and into the Dakotas is something that has also been fairly prevalent in that area going back again to October. So how's this all been impacting stream flows? Well, I like to look at the longer term averages just to take out any types of swings that we see. And you can see for the most part, the stations that are reporting and not iced over for this time of year, pretty much everything is in that greater than 90th percentile to record high readings as you look into Wisconsin and Michigan, northern Illinois, northern Indiana and Ohio. But as you go further south, you get to more of the normal readings. And then also in that area of Missouri and even into western Illinois, you start seeing the impact of some of this longer term dryness that has been in the region, where we are seeing readings in the below normal to much below normal, meaning that those percentiles are falling in the 10 to 24th percentile, and the red dot in western Illinois is below the 10th percentile. And some of that can be due to seasonal fluctuations and also some ice buildup on some of those waterways where it has impacted flows, but for the most part those areas have been fairly free flowing. For the most part, the hydrology in the region is ample right now on the surface water flows, and we're not seeing too many low flows outside of a few areas of again, Missouri and western Kansas and southwest Nebraska. So looking at the Missouri River Basin as a whole, again, looking at those areas in western Kansas and southwest Nebraska with some lower flows, but for the most part, the basin's doing quite well until you get into the lower reaches. Looking at the upper Mississippi, again, most of those flows in the further north reaches are fine, and then the readings in western Illinois and east Missouri are starting to show themselves a little bit more clearly. And as we go into the Ohio River Valley as well, we're seeing much of the flows to be normal to above normal, with only sporadic stations below normal, and some of that could be seasonal. So looking at the snowpack for the Missouri River Basin and the water content. So above Fort Peck, we're right at the 91st percent of average, and you can see where that accumulation is based on the 81 to 2010 average on the left. And then from Peck to Garrison, we actually are above normal with 130%, and you can see that normally by February 15th, about 70% of the peak snow water equivalency has occurred in both of these reaches. So with only about 30% of the historical peak left to be accumulated, if I am saying that correctly, we're not probably going to see these numbers change a whole lot. Again, we're going to have to really focus on what the weather patterns are looking like, as the warm weather is bringing more liquid precipitation than snowfall actually. And looking at the Platte basins, the total North Platte Basin is running above normal right now, and the total South Platte Basin is running above normal as well. So looking at the Platte Basin, there looks to be adequate water that will be going through the reservoir systems and being released downstream as the spring and early summer snowpack melts off. And just to put that into perspective, we have the streamflow forecast on the left from the NRCS SNOTEL sites, as well as the basin averages. And you can see through most of Wyoming and Colorado and the Platte basins and that portion of the Missouri River Basin, those are all running well above normal. They've had a very good snow season. Again, northeast Wyoming did stand out on some of the other graphics that we showed as being slightly below, but they're still running at least in the 70 to 80th percentile. And then when we get into central Montana, we are seeing a little bit of a drop off there where some of those central basins have not had as much snow. And if you look at the streamflow forecast on the left, it's reflected on what percent of average they're expecting as far as the runoff associated with the snowpack. And again, we are mid-February, so we do have some time for seasonal accumulations to continue, but as the other graphic showed, most of that accumulation, or 70% of it, has been accumulated traditionally up to this point. As we shift further east towards the Great Lakes, this is showing the water level on 4 of the lakes, and what we're seeing is right now the red lines for each lake is the average, and for the most part we are right at average to slightly above average, and the bars are looking at the forecast going forward, and so we're anticipating the lake levels to increase as far as their elevation to be above normal as we go forward here in 2017. One thing that has been interesting to mention on the Great Lakes right now is there's not much ice. We see a lot of open water. Right now only a little over 10% of the Great Lakes are showing ice cover with a lot of open water, and we can see that the water temperatures are already getting into close to that 40-degree Fahrenheit range with that open water and the seasonal warmth that we've been seeing right now in February. Looking at soil moisture anomalies, again, there had been quite a few reports, especially in parts of Illinois, that the late summer rains did a good job of recharging the soils. But what we are seeing is this pocket of dry soils from eastern Oklahoma and Texas through Arkansas into Missouri and now into western Illinois and catching southwest Iowa as well, where when you start looking at the total column of available moisture in the soil, there is some deficits that are building, and some of those are approaching 100 to 150 millimeters of moisture that is not showing up in the soil profile. And for the most part, this really is the hot spot, so to speak, is that soil moisture deficiency in the country. And when we look at other parts of the region, we can see the excess of moisture in Iowa and Minnesota, and especially Wisconsin and parts of the Dakotas. But then there are some pockets in North Dakota, eastern South Dakota, central Nebraska, where some of these soil moisture deficits have been existing for quite some time and did not get that good recharge that's typically expected in the fall and winter months. So that brings us to the Drought Monitor. When we look at the nation as a whole, we are seeing that there are still some areas of drought that stand out, and that's really been the long-term drought in California that we've seen a lot of improvement on over the last several weeks, as well as the development of some dryness in Arkansas and Oklahoma and into parts of northern Texas. Some of the lingering dryness in western Kansas and eastern Colorado in the Black Hills region of South Dakota and into Wyoming. And then some of this developing dryness in Missouri, we're starting to see some moderate drought develop. And then the last two areas are in the southeast, where we had flash drought develop last fall, and we have seen some recovery, but still some localized dryness with some severe to even extreme drought in Georgia left, and some long-term dryness up in New England that has really been impacting some of those areas, especially with their groundwater and surface water supplies. As we look at the statistics for the U.S., just for the contiguous U.S. right now, we're right at 13.54% of the country is in drought, and we do not see much extreme or exceptional drought on the map right now, less than right at 35%. And when we put this into perspective, there's about 90 million people, give or take, that are being impacted by drought in the U.S. right now in the contiguous 48 states. So that number has actually gone down. About 3 or 4 months ago, we were about 120 million, with a lot of the California drought really pushing that number up. And as that's recovered, this number has steadily declined. When we compare these numbers to last week, we've seen improvement from 3 months ago, where almost about 17% reduction in drought over the U.S. from 3 months ago. And if we look out a year ago, we were at a little over 15% of the country in drought and 13.5% now. So not much difference from last year to this year, except where we are seeing those drought episodes being identified. If we look at the north central region here, all the way from Montana to Ohio, really fairly quiet. Again, it is the winter months where we don't typically see a lot of drought development or recovery, as that fact goes, this time of year. And so a lot of this map has not changed recently outside of portions of Missouri and Illinois, where we have seen some of this dryness developing. For the region, we're a little over 10% of the region in drought. We see a little bit of D2 severe drought in Colorado and southwest Kansas, but for the most part, the abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions are mainly what we're seeing. And again, this has really been dictated by the time of year we're in, that we do not typically see drought developing rapidly during the winter months. If we look at the Missouri River watershed by itself, a little over 13.5% of the region is in moderate drought, with just a little bit of the Missouri Basin in Colorado showing up in severe drought. And for the most part, again, not a huge issue at this time throughout the basin. So what kind of changes have we seen since the last call a month ago? Using these Drought Monitor change maps, what we can see is anything in the yellows, browns, and oranges are degradation, and anything in the greens and blues are improvement. And so really over the region as a whole, we have seen quite a bit of improvement, even in central Missouri, up to a point where improvement had been made, and I think we're going to start seeing some of that revert back if the dryness continues. But not a lot of yellow on the map, a little bit in Colorado, Montana, parts of Nebraska and Missouri, where we've seen a one-class change, but for the most part, again, drought's been fairly stable and quiet, so to speak, in the north central region. The big changes, again, if you look out in California, 3-class changes over the last month, and continual wet events occurring out there. So looking at regional impacts, just a quick graphic that was sent along to me on the number of acres of winter wheat planted for the 2016 season. So a lot of times that question comes up, is where are those wheat regions? And you can really see that the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, as well as into central Kansas and Oklahoma and southwest Nebraska and parts of South Dakota, are really where those main winter wheat areas are located. So as a region, the winter has been quiet as far as snowfall. And what that means is we have seen fairly good precipitation through the region, as I'd shown on some of those other graphics, outside of that dry spot in Missouri and Illinois. But a lot of that precipitation has come as rain. And again, with the temperatures we've seen, that shouldn't be too surprising. But right now, looking at just where the snow is and how much water is left in that snow, really you got to get into North Dakota, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and parts of Michigan before you're getting into any of those areas that have really any snow left on the ground. And even what's left, you're only seeing maybe 4 to 6 inches of water in those snowpacks, mainly in North Dakota. In comparison, when you look at the Rocky Mountain locations where there's 20 to 30 inches of water stored in the snowpack up in the mountains, you can see that through much of the plains and Midwest, there just really has not been much snow this winter, and there really isn't much left. And what is left has been deteriorating quite quickly with the warm weather that we've been seeing. And Mike Timlin passed along these graphics from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, showing that the accumulated snowfall, the departure from the mean, from basically the snow season going back to July 1st to present. And we can see most of the region is below normal to significantly below normal for snowfall for this time of year. All those areas in the yellows are right at 20 inches below snowfall, or below average snowfall for the season, and up not only for the season, but really throughout the entire region. Just really haven't seen much as far as normal snow. Not until you get into Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, and parts of northern Nebraska and northern Minnesota are you seeing these above normal accumulations of snow for the season. And if you look at that as a percent of the mean, North Dakota really stands out right at 200% of normal. But as you get into Kansas, Missouri, Southern Illinois, into Kentucky, most of those areas have only seen 5 to 10% of normal snowfall for the season, which, again, we did get precipitation, but more occurrences of liquid snowfall versus snow accumulation. And there are associated problems with that we'll get to with some of the regional discussion coming forth. So looking at agriculture impacts in the region, again, not a lot of agricultural activity going on right now, but some of the comments, the exposed winter wheat in areas of Kansas and Nebraska, along with some of the cold snaps that we had, is going to allow for some winter kill to be observed when the crop does come out of dormancy. And I brought up the second bullet already with the adequate soil moisture recharge in most locations. We have had some reports of standing water in the fields, and that's been going on in Nebraska, Ohio, and even in parts of Illinois. One of the comments that really stood out to me was most everyone was reporting how quickly the frost was exiting the ground throughout much of the region where there isn't any snowpack. As those areas have been exposed to the solar heating for much of the winter, not only was there not a lot of frost developed in the ground through the winter months, but what is left is quickly going away. And after this weekend, we are going to be seeing fewer and fewer places even with any frost in the ground. And some of this, going to the next point here, some of the concerns of this rapidly developing spring, so to speak, is the impact on items such as fruit trees in Missouri. It was brought up that as they start leaving dormancy and start getting buds, what would be the impact of a hard freeze right now or a cold snap in the region? And it does have some people on edge, especially those producers that are in that fruit business. One of the comments coming out of Nebraska was the muddy feedlots has become an issue for livestock producers, and that goes into the next point as well, that South Dakota has observed the calving season starting 2 to 3 weeks earlier than normal, and some of this has been attributed to the warm weather we've seen recently. And if you ask most livestock producers, they'd rather deal with the cold than the muddy, wet conditions that can really impact new calves. So that's becoming a concern as we're seeing those calves starting to drop already. And as those exposed soils are softening up as spring rapidly approaches, again, mud is becoming a fairly common issue all over the region, that not only is it making any early field prep work nearly impossible, but also that standing water and associated muddy conditions are going to have to subside before any type of field work is going to be possible in the region. Again, going to hit some of the states on some of the highlights that were provided to me from the network of folks who help contribute to these webinars. In Missouri, Pat's comments were very mild February in Columbia, and it's going to rank up there with one of the mildest Februaries on record in his neck of the woods. In Wyoming, some of the heavy snows coupled with winds have toppled some steel power poles in the state. Some of the warm weather has allowed for the ice to break up on rivers, and then followed by some ice jams, especially in the Bighorn Basin, and that's going to cause some lowland flooding. And high winds in parts of Wyoming and even into Colorado in excess of 70 to 90 miles per hour has caused some travel issues where some semi-trucks were actually being blown off the road or toppled on the interstates due to the high winds they were experiencing. As we go into South Dakota, again, the snow cover that is left is declining quite rapidly. More instances this winter, especially over the last 6 weeks, of icing conditions, shutting down some of the travel routes and interstates compared to a normal winter. Again, that's going to be very reflective of some of the warm weather that we've been seeing, that more of this precipitation has been falling as rain or freezing rain compared to snow in a typical winter. Hearing from Pete up in Minnesota, 18 consecutive months of above normal temperatures in the Twin Cities has been observed. The maximum frost depths have been reached, and that has been generally in the 18 to 20 inch range. And in the central and southern parts of the state, those are declining quite quickly again, as there hasn't been any snow cover to insulate that frost in the ground. They've been dealing with some bad lake ice conditions in the state. Ice fishing is an activity that's prevalent in Minnesota with all the lakes, and they've had some issues with vehicles going through ice and impacting some ice fishing competitions, etc. in the state. And also Pete mentioned that freezing rain throughout the winter, especially in the southern portions of the state and into parts of northern Iowa, has been very unique this year compared to most winters where that has typically fallen as snow. Moving over to Iowa, spring flood potential is high in the northern portions of the state where saturated soils and snow will combine to cause issues. There's about 9 to 18 inches of frost left in the soil in the northern half of the state, which is below normal, and portions of central to southern Iowa have been frost-free this winter for much of the season, and it's anticipated that after the warm weekend that's going to be impacting the region, that this will be the case for the rest of winter as well. It's still very dry in south central Iowa, but no winter impacts to report as far as the drought conditions go. In Illinois, going to continue to monitor areas of these precipitation deficits going into spring, because the opportunity of rapid drought development in these areas is quite likely right now if the weather pattern does not change and if moisture does not return to these areas. The stage is already set for drought to develop quite quickly, where this dryness has gone back to last October. In North Dakota, it's noted the Red River has a high probability, a 75 to 90% chance of flooding by the first week of April, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in the Outlook section. And some regional issues as a whole. Again, many states are reporting an increase in fire danger due to the dryness from lack of snow and snow cover, and also the winds that have been drying out those dead fuel loads on the surface. And so we have this period right now between as we warm up and things dry out before green up happens, where fire danger really starts increasing for this time of year. And you can see the hazards outlook, at least for high winds, going forward next week or so. And we can see that some of these areas are going to possibly be prone for an increased fire danger associated with these high winds. And finally, we'll end here with the outlooks. So I'm going to do a couple slides on some of the flood potential in the region, and then go into the 7-day, 8 to 14-day, the ENSO outlook, the monthly, and then some of the seasonal products going forward, as well as the seasonal drought outlook. And so the next slide or so is courtesy of some folks with the River Forecast Centers, and multiple people come together to put these together, and they were nice enough to pass them my way. And so just really looking at the region as a whole, some of these areas have 50% or greater chance of flooding by through April, and North Dakota really stands out with the Red River Basin and the Souris River Basin as well. And then also some areas of northern Illinois where we're seeing some of these gauges that are really ranking quite high. And again, most of those areas are in places where there's already high water levels and or accumulating snowpacks that will be melting off and going into these basins, and also where soils were quite saturated going into the winter months already. So there is this flood risk that's going to be developing as we move forward, especially as that remaining snow starts to melt. And this will be updated again in early March, so we'll see how that changes in the next few weeks compared to what we're seeing with this latest update. As we go into the 7-day precipitation outlook, we can see again an active weather pattern across the West Coast, with multiple storms being anticipated hitting most of California again, with some high precipitation totals. We also see it quite active down in the Gulf Coast region, but most of that is going to miss the drought areas that have been developing down there. But as you see, this map is fairly green. So that's saying that the forecast for precipitation over the next 7 days, basically taking us through the 23rd of February, that most all places have a chance of seeing at least some precipitation, which that would help with some of the fire danger that we're seeing. But we also see that some of the drier pockets are in Nebraska and Colorado and through the Dakotas, as well as in portions of Illinois, Missouri, and into the Ohio River Valley itself. So we'll just have to see how these, for one, how these storm tracks develop and where they are steered towards our region when they are coming across the mountains, and where they end up, and just how much moisture they can tap into. So we'll see what happens in the next week. Next 8 to 14 days, as we look at the temperature outlook on the lower left and the precipitation outlook on the lower right, what we're seeing is almost the entire region has above normal chances of above normal temperatures, really with that bullseye with the highest probabilities over the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes regions. We have near normal chances of either above or below as we get into the western Dakotas and western Nebraska, into portions of Wyoming and Montana for temperatures. And then as we get into precipitation, almost the entire region is showing above normal chances of seeing above normal precipitation during the 8 to 14 day outlook period. So we'll see how that comes to fruition. And again, we'll be watching some of the areas to, again, with the storm track, exactly how that will play out. As we start talking about ENSO and La Nina and El Nino, what we're seeing is, with the latest update here, that we are indeed in neutral conditions, and we continue to see that neutral conditions are anticipated through much of the summer. And with that being said, at that point we start seeing a pretty good divergence of what could happen. Some models are showing cooling to take place, and some models are showing that warming will take place. There has been some discussion that right now between the dynamical and statistical models, there's this divergence between them, where the dynamics are showing more of a trend towards an El Nino developing, where the statistical are opposite, showing more of a trend towards neutral. So we're going to have to really see how that plays out. I think it's too soon to really say what we're going to be seeing as far as the end of summer into early fall of next year, but it is part of the discussion and something we'll be keeping track of. And with that being said, as we get into the monthly and seasonal outlooks with very little ENSO forcing, we see more equal chances on the map in places, and we also see less skill associated with these. So as we look at the upper half of this graphic for March, most of this region for temperatures is showing equal chances of above or below normal temperatures, with some below normal probabilities showing up in Montana and the Dakotas and portions of northern Wyoming. And then for precipitation, that area of potentially cooler temperatures is also coupled with an area of potentially above normal precipitation, with much of the rest of the region showing equal chances for March. And as we look at the season, the spring season of March, April, May, it looks like that trend of above normal temperatures continuing that we've seen going back to last fall has a fairly high likelihood of continuing, with probabilities of 33 to 40% through much of the region of above normal chances of above normal temperatures. Those areas of Montana and western Dakotas and northern Wyoming, more equal chances again and again. That's been an area where we have seen cooler than normal temperatures throughout this time. It looks like the precipitation chances are greatest, or the highest probabilities of above normal precipitation along the Canadian border with Montana and North Dakota. But again, a lot of the region is showing an enhancement of higher probabilities of above normal precipitation during the spring months. As we get into the summer outlook, again, we see EC equal chances through a good chunk of the region, which is coupled by higher than normal probabilities of above normal temperatures through much of the Midwest and High Plains. and that EC for precipitation pretty much dominates the entire region for the summer. And again, this is June, July, and August. And taking that into account with the seasonal drought outlook, which is taking us through the end of May at this point, we are seeing that drought in eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, western Kansas, and the Oklahoma Panhandle, a lot of persistence, showing that drought is going to maintain where it's at now. And it looks like some of the other areas, those that are in green, we're seeing some drought removal likely, and those that are in gray, some drought remaining, but some improvements. So for the most part, right now it is showing that for our region, drought is not going to be an issue now between the end of May. But again, as I mentioned, we're going to have to watch some of those areas in western Illinois and central Missouri where those longer-term dry signals have been quite evident. And again, up in the Black Hills, that signal has been off and on. There's been some wet months bookended by some very dry periods, so we're going to have to see how that develops as well. So quickly go through some summary bullets. A continuing trend of warmer than normal conditions continues for most of this region. We're seeing it right now and anticipating it to be going on through again the next week or so, week to 2 weeks in the region. Abruptly ending winter, hopefully, maybe at this point, we don't know. Every time we think we've put the end of winter, some years it stays warm, and other years we'll get a late winter, early spring event that will change our minds at least. And outside of the northern reaches, most of the region recorded fairly low snow totals to date for this winter. And those graphics really showed that even though some areas had above normal precipitation, a lot of that was falling as liquid precipitation. Pockets of drought remain in the area of Missouri and Illinois. They're being monitored, like I've said, and we are starting to see some impacts to surface flows on the USGS data in those areas. La Nina has subsided and neutral conditions are projected through the summer. With no oceanic forcing, the skill associated with longer-term outlooks is reduced. And there are some flood concerns developing throughout the region as those fully recharged soils and winter snows up to the north, coupled with good mountain snowpacks in the higher elevations, will potentially impact the region. And again, we're going to have to, the warm-up is really going to dictate how quickly some of that water starts heading out of the mountains into the region as well through the Missouri River Basin, especially on the Platte Basin. So today's webinars are recorded again. There's the links to that. We have some links to some of the partners and their portals of information, how to reach the state climate offices, how to reach the regional climate centers. And I will now take questions. Here are the folks that really work to put this together each month, and you can reach us here. And with that, Doug, I'll take a drink and open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian. There's a number of things I think that folks want discussed. We'll try and do it as quickly as possible. I know there are a lot of concerns in terms of flooding, especially up north. When I say up north, I really mean North Dakota and maybe the border of Minnesota with the Red River Saurus and Spirit Lake, Devil's Lake. There are enhanced probabilities of moderate to major flood in all those different places. I would say this particular conversation probably isn't the best place to go into great detail about that, but your local National Weather Service office and/or River Forecast Center has complete data on that. In fact, they're in the process of briefing partners and stakeholders on that in the Mississippi Basin as well in the next few weeks and even later today. So, oh wait, could you go back a couple slides, Brian? Yeah, there you go. Nope, forward. There you go. Thanks. Someone requested to see some of those things there. The other thing I want to bring up is that another question that we had was the importance of snowpack on agriculture. And, well, before I do that, I'm sorry. Let's go to agriculture concerns this summer for the north central region due to dry winters. We had a question about that. There isn't necessarily a very strong correlation between the two. Brian, you can talk more on this, or Dennis if you'd like. However, those are indicators those are sort of indicating things that we watch when all we have to go on is something like equal chances of above, near normal, or below normal for precipitation and or temperature. Then we have to kind of rely upon what are the conditions currently and what are the antecedent conditions. So if the soil moisture is already wet going into the spring, then you have somewhat of a buffer in case you don't get a lot of spring rains. In some of those places where we're going into the spring a little bit dry, like in Missouri, Brian pointed that out very, very clearly. If we miss those spring rains, we're likely to be in a little. The probability of drought is enhanced, I guess you could say. So it is very early to tell right now whether that's going to be a problem for agriculture or stream flow or anything else later this summer right now. But if again you start missing March and April, especially May, precipitation events in those areas, yeah, it's going to be an issue. And if you have an early warm up in which plants begin to evapotranspirate that moisture out of the soil column, it can be an issue, like we saw in 2012, as a matter of fact. Any other comments, Brian?
No, you covered it well, Doug.
Okay, or Dennis?
Yeah, the bigger carryover we watch for is fall wetness, because since there's no plants growing in that soil, those soils stay wet throughout the winter. So the places that are wet from last fall are likely going to be starting off wet, will not be able to take up much additional moisture. Those areas that are dry that Brian pointed out, spring precipitation is more than is evaporated or transpired by plants, so it is a soil moisture recharge time. So we have an opportunity to overcome the dryness that exists there. But Doug was right. If we don't get much recovery in the next couple months, then there is a level of risk.
Right. I know let's see, there was a question again from Benjamin Diamond about agricultural concern. Let's see, is the importance of snowpack for Midwestern agriculture. I tried to answer that. I think I answered that to everybody, that snow is important obviously for water supply generally, but it's also important to cover certain crops like winter wheat from cold, very harsh cold temperatures, which can do a lot of damage to wheat as it comes up. Any other comments you guys want to make on the importance of snowpack for Midwestern agriculture?
I think one of the things that snow does too is it buffers those first few inches of the soil from drying out excessively and becoming hard and crusted over during the winter months if that snow is there, versus how they've been exposed through to drying out through much of this winter.
Right.
And there are places further north that do a lot of tillage. We won't go into the benefits or detriments of doing lots of tillage, but they expect to have snowfall covering there because when that tillage is done, that smooths the surface out. We've had years previously where they've done lots of tillage and then not had much snowfall, and then you still have a very rough surface to deal with around springtime.
Right.
But the soil it does also protect a protection from that soil from wind, erosion, that sort of thing.
Yep, and I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention, I think Brian began pointing this out, is that the southern part of this region, this sort of central part of the region, basically from eastern Colorado to Kentucky, and has been in a literal snow drought because we're ranking the amount of snow we've had in Kansas City, for example, is 100. I think the numbers were 121 out of 123 years, or something along those lines. So it's one of the driest snow accumulating years that we've had, and that is true pretty broadly across the region. Now, the repercussions from that, obviously, well, we got rain instead in some cases, but not in all cases. Sometimes it's just dry. just want to talk about El Nino, La Nina just for a minute. In Brian's summary, he said there was, I'll take exception to one of his comments, that there's no oceanic influence on our weather and climate here. Actually, there always is, but what we don't have is a strong connection to the El Nino, La Nina southern oscillation. We just don't know what they are. That's usually the case, unless we do have a strong El Nino, La Nina going on. Those things really help us make better forecasts. Any other comments on El Nino, La Nina? What we've seen, I guess the other thing I'll say before anybody else talks is that we've seen a lot of lots of folks, not official people, individuals come out with their own sort of ideas on what's going to be happening to La Nina or El Nino, and some people are saying, oh, we're going to go back to El Nino for sure. It would be the first time that we would, or second time actually, it did it once in the 60s, I guess, that we've gone from El Nino to La Nina, and then within the next year gone back to El Nino. So it's pretty rare that happens. It can, but it's not likely, even though some of the dynamical models are showing that. In the oceans, as the oceans are right now, there's nothing leading us to that conclusion. Now all of that said, there's still we're up against a very hard time to predict anything beyond the next month or two, maybe 3, because there's a prediction barrier that we run into this time of year. So yeah, Dennis, if you have any more comments, feel free to comment.
I'll only qualify one thing: from a moderate or strong El Nino to La Nina, back to El Nino in consecutive years.
Right.
There have been weaker ones, but not from a moderate or strong.
Yeah. And then, see, are there any more questions? Oh yeah, there's a couple more here. I'm sorry. Any parallels to 2012 so far in terms of the dry winter? Brian?
I don't think so up to this point, because when we look at some of the precipitation statistics, and I'll see if I can put that graphic back up, but 2012, that winter was, and even starting from the fall of 2011 into the winter of 2012, it was quite dry throughout much of the region. And then the rapid warm up and rapid green up in the spring of 2012 really amplified what we saw develop in June and July. And I don't see the parallels to this year right now as I look at conditions, and really we're seeing some pockets of dryness when we go back to October, but even there we're showing 50 to 70% of normal, and most of that again has been in parts of western Kansas, southern Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois.
Yeah, 2012 wasn't helped along also because of the March temperatures in the 80s for 2 or 3 weeks in a row.
Yeah, you had March, you were, for the whole month, you were dealing in some places with double-digit above average temperatures. And right now, we don't see anything like that protracted at this point.
And then we had another question: top 10 lowest snow totals currently for Lexington, Louisville, and Bowling Green. Chip is pointing that out to us. Thanks, Chip. Yeah. So I think top 10 for a number of locales, actually. Now, of course, that means we're going to get a blizzard in March, late March. It's going to catch us up, but no, I'm not predicting that. Don't put that down. Don't write that down.
Remember, Doug Cluck is projecting that.
Yeah, stranger things have happened, of course. Any other questions or comments? I can open up the phone if you want to ask it live or anything like that. I'm not getting any. Any other comments from you, Brian, or Dennis?
No, none.
Dennis Tade from the USDA, by the way, is helping us out today again. Hey, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording and hope to see you back next month on the 16th for Martha Shulsky. Thanks, Brian.
All right,
Appreciate
thank
that.
you, everyone.